At the center of this universe stood Maestro Julian Thorn, a man sculpted from arrogance and tailored silk. His silver hair was a perfectly coiffed storm, his posture a testament to a lifetime of command. To the 100 musicians seated before him, he was not just a conductor. He was a deity of tempo and tone, his baton a scepter that could summon thunder or command silence. He ruled his kingdom with an iron will and a tongue sharpened by disdain for anything less than perfection. Today, however, perfection had abandoned him. The star soloist, a world-renowned pianist, had canceled, citing a sudden illness just hours before the final rehearsal for the annual Benefactors Gala. The centerpiece of the gala was the premiere of Symphony of Embers, a monstrously difficult piece, and its linchpin was a piano solo so complex it was spoken of in hushed, fearful tones by conservatory students. Thorn was incandescent with rage. The fury rolled off him in palpable waves, silencing the nervous coughs and rustling of sheet music. His eyes, cold chips of blue ice, scanned the orchestra, daring anyone to meet his gaze. At the periphery of this tense drama, almost a part of the shadows, was Alara. She was the hall's page-turner for the season, a job she took to be close to the music that was the silent orchestra of her own soul. She wore a simple, gray dress, practical and clean, and her hands, though nimble, bore the faint calluses of a life lived far from the velvet-lined cases of Stradivarius violins. She moved with a quiet efficiency that rendered her invisible to men like Maestro Thorn. She was furniture, as a ghost, but her eyes were alive, absorbing every note, her heart beating in time with the phantom rhythm of the symphony. She had studied the score for Symphony of Embers every night, tracing the furious cascades of notes with her finger, hearing the ferocious chords in her mind. It was a language she understood intimately. This is the story of a moment that would change everything. A story that proves you can never judge a soul by the clothes it wears. If you believe in the power of hidden talent, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss more stories that stir the heart. Thorn's voice sliced through the tension. So, the great Alistair Petrov cancels. He has a migraine, he said, his voice a venomous sneer, leaving us and our generous benefactors with a gaping, silent wound at the heart of our performance. He paced before the stage, his expensive leather shoes echoing like gunshots in the vast hall. What are we to do? Perhaps one of you has been hiding a world-class talent for the piano, he asked. His question, a rhetorical blade meant to wound. Laughter, nervous and sycophantic, trickled through the orchestra. His gaze swept the room and then, with a predator's instinct for the weakest prey, it landed on Alara. She was standing near the grand piano, her gaze lost in the complex ink of the sheet music resting there. A cruel theatrical idea began to form in Thorn's mind. He would make a spectacle. He would vent his frustration on this nobody, this speck of dust, and in doing so, remind everyone present of the insurmountable gulf between genius and the common rabble. You, he barked. Alara started, her heart lurching. The entire orchestra turned to look at her. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping away her comfortable invisibility. Yes, you, the page-turner. You seem fascinated by the score. Perhaps you believe you can play it. The silence that followed was thick with humiliation. Lara could feel the color rising in her cheeks. She simply stood, frozen, her hands clasped before her. Thorn smiled, a cold reptilian curving of the lips. I see we have a silent prodigy. In our midst, he announced to the room, his voice dripping with saccharine mockery. The orchestra shifted uncomfortably. This was a new level of cruelty, even for Thorn. Well, don't be shy. The stage is yours. Come, grace us with your interpretation. He gestured grandly to the magnificent Steinway, a polished black beast gleaming under the stage lights. It was an altar of sacrifice, and he was the high priest, ready to perform. The ritual. He was forcing a simple woman to play a difficult piano piece, a public execution of her dignity, completely unaware that he was about to command a genius to reveal herself. Alara felt a strange stillness descend upon her. The initial shock and sting of humiliation began to recede. replaced by something else, something ancient and powerful stirring within her. It was the music. It was calling to her. She looked at the mocking face of the maestro, at the pitying and curious eyes of the musicians, and then at the piano. That was the only thing that was real. With a quiet dignity that baffled the onlookers, she took a small step forward, then another. The rustle of her simple dress was the only sound as she moved from the shadows into the unforgiving light of the stage. She did not look at the maestro. She did not look at the audience of her peers. She looked only at the 88 keys that held the universe of her unspoken life, and walked towards her destiny. The walk from the edge of the stage to the center felt like a journey across a vast, silent desert. Every eye in the Orpheum Philharmonic was fixed on Alara, this unassuming woman in a plain gray dress, now the unwilling focal point of Maestro Thorne's cruel theater. The musicians, a sea of black-clad professionals, watched her approach the gleaming Steinway with a mixture of emotions. There was pity for her public shaming, a morbid curiosity to see how this disaster would unfold, and for a few, a sliver of disgust at their conductor's casual brutality. They were the silent witnesses, complicit in their inaction. Maestro Thorne, for his part, was savoring the moment. He folded his arms, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. This was his stage, his orchestra, his power. He would make an example of this woman, a lesson in humility for anyone who dared to dream above their station. For the benefit of our amateur, he announced, his voice booming with condescension, this is not some simple parlor tune. The Andante Furioso of the Symphony of Embers is a test of fire. The arpeggios, he gestured to the sheet music with a flourish, are like cascades of broken glass. The chordal progressions require the hand strength of a blacksmith and the soul of a tortured poet. It is, to put it simply, impossible for the untrained. He turned his icy gaze back to Alara, who was now standing beside the piano bench. But please do not let me intimidate you. Entertain us. In the back of the hall, nestled amongst towering shelves of scores and manuscripts, Mr. Alistair Finch, the orchestra's elderly librarian, watched the scene unfold. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles etched by decades of devotion to music, was unreadable to most, but where others saw an impending train wreck, Alistair saw a glimmer of something else. He had seen Alara before, not just as a page-turner, but in the quiet hours after rehearsals had ended. He had once been searching for a misplaced score late at night and heard the faint, ghostly notes of a Chopin nocturne coming from a forgotten storage room. Peeking in, he saw Alara, her eyes closed, her fingers dancing over the keys of a dusty, out-of-tune upright piano. She wasn't playing with ambition. She was communing with a part of herself. He had seen the worn leather-bound book of Bach's preludes she kept in her bag, new. As Alara pulled out the piano bench, a slight scrape against the floorboards echoing in the cavernous silence, his eyes met hers across the distance. He gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, almost lost in the grand hall, but for Alara it was an anchor. It was a confirmation that she was not entirely alone. Alara sat down. The contrast was breathtaking. Her simple, almost monastic dress against the deep, polished opulence of the world's finest piano, her hands clean but marked by a life of work, hovered over the smooth, perfect keys, a stark juxtaposition to the manicured, insured hands of the virtuosos who usually commanded this instrument. For a moment, she allowed herself to get lost in her own inner world. The maestro's taunts faded into a dull, irrelevant hum. The sea of faces blurred into an impressionistic wash of color. Brief, poignant images flickered through her mind. Her grandmother's warm hands guiding her own small ones on the keys of a yellowed, upright piano in their tiny cottage. The scent of rain on the window pane as she practiced for hours, the music her only shield against a lonely childhood. The painful decision, years later, to sell that beloved piano to pay for her mother's medical bills. The dream was not abandoned. It was sacrificed. It had lived on, dormant but alive, a secret garden inside her that no hardship could ever uproot. The maestro's voice, impatient now, cut through her reverie. "We are waiting. Ilara did not look at him. She looked at the music at the first bar. She saw not just notes, but a story of defiance. She took a slow, deep breath, letting it fill her lungs, steadying the universe within her. She flexed her fingers once, a silent prayer. The silence in the hall was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a living entity, a heavy blanket of suspense pressing down on every soul in the room. It was the breath held before the lightning strike. Maestro Thorn tapped his foot, a sharp, impatient sound. He gave a final, dismissive wave of his hand. "Proceed," he commanded, the word laced with boredom, as if swatting a fly. He turned slightly, ready to share a look of derision with his concertmaster, who was already anticipating the clumsy, discordant sounds, the inevitable failure that would vindicate his cruelty. It was in that moment of inattention that Ilara's fingers finally made contact with the keys. The first note did not stumble into the room. It bloomed. It was not the tentative touch of an amateur, but the confident, resonant strike of a master. It was a single, perfect C-sharp, so pure and filled with such profound, melancholic beauty that it seemed to hang in the air like a star in a midnight sky. A collective, involuntary gasp swept through the orchestra. The concertmaster, who had been ready to smirk with Thorn, froze, his eyes widening. Thorn himself whipped his head back towards the piano, his expression of smug certainty instantly shattering, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. The note faded, and before the silence could reclaim the space, Ilara began to play. What followed was not a performance. It was an incandescent event. The cascades of broken glass that Thorn had mocked became shimmering, precise waterfalls of crystalline sound, each note distinct, yet part of a flawless roaring current. The impossible arpeggios, which would have tangled the fingers of lesser pianists, were executed with a ferocious grace, her hands a blur of controlled power over the keyboard. She was no longer reading the music. She was channeling it, breathing life into the ink on the page. The symphony's theme of embers, of beauty rising from ashes, was her own story. The quiet, sorrowful passages spoke of her lost childhood piano, of dreams deferred. The tumultuous, angry chords raged with the injustices she had silently endured. The music built layer upon layer of complexity and emotion, and Ilara was its absolute sovereign. Her body, once so still and contained, now swayed with the rhythm, a physical extension of the sound she was creating. Her eyes were closed, her face a portrait of sublime concentration and release. The hall and everyone in it had ceased to exist for her. There was only the music, the story that had lived inside her for years, now finally being told. The effect on the audience of musicians was profound. Initial shock gave way to a state of utter awe. A cellist, a woman known for her stoicism, had tears streaming down her face, her bow resting forgotten on her lap. The burly veteran timpanist stared, his mallets held loosely in his hands, his mouth agape. They were not just hearing technical perfection. They were witnessing a soul laid bare. They were hearing the truth, a truth so potent it vibrated in their own chests. Thorn was a statue carved from shock. His face was pale, his hands limp at his sides. Every condescending word he had spoken now echoed in his mind as a testament to his own monumental foolishness. He, the great Maestro Thorn, the arbiter of talent, had been blind and deaf. He was watching a force of nature he had mistaken for a pebble. As the piece raced towards its climax, a furious, breathtaking maelstrom of sound, the music seemed to lift the very roof off the hall. Ilara's fingers flew across the keyboard in a display of virtuosity so staggering it seemed to defy the limits of human anatomy. It was a storm, a fire, a declaration. It was the sound of a lifetime of silence breaking into a single, glorious, earth-shattering roar. The final, thunderous chord of the Andante Furioso exploded into the hall, a majestic, definitive statement that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Then, as Ilara's hands lifted from the keys, the sound did not simply end. It lingered, its vibrations hanging in the air like a sacred mist, shimmering with the raw power of the performance. An absolute, profound silence followed. It was not The tense, awkward silence of before, but a silence of reverence, of awe, of a collective mind trying to process the miracle it had just witnessed. No one coughed, no one shuffled, no one dared to breathe. The spell was complete. Woven by the unassuming woman in the simple gray dress, who now sat before the grand piano, her chest rising and falling with the aftermath of her emotional torrent, Ilara slowly opened her eyes. She did not look at the stunned faces of the orchestra, nor did she seek out the shattered expression of Maestro Thorn. Her gaze fell to her own hands, resting now in her lap, as if seeing them for the first time. Then she looked at the piano keys with a quiet, tender affection, a silent thank you to an old and trusted friend. With the same quiet dignity with which she had arrived, she stood up, pushed the bench back into its place, and prepared to walk back into the shadows she had always known. But the shadows would not have her back. The silence was finally broken, not by applause, but by a single, deliberate sound. The concertmaster, a man who had played under the world's greatest conductors, slowly raised his violin bow and began to tap it rhythmically against the metal of his music stand. It was a gesture of the highest respect, an honor reserved not for mere performers, but for true artists. Another musician, a viola player, joined in, her tap adding to the rhythm. Then another and another. Within seconds, the entire orchestra had joined the tribute. A rising chorus of tapping bows and shuffling feet, a wave of percussive, heartfelt thunder that was more moving than any ovation. It was an apology, a coronation, and a welcome. They were not applauding a page-turner, they were saluting one of their own. Maestro Thorn stood frozen, a man hollowed out by his own arrogance. The applause of his orchestra, directed at the woman he had tried to destroy, was a verdict against him. He was a ghost at his own feast. He watched as Ilara, slightly bewildered by the tribute, gave a small, humble bow of her head, stumbled forward, his polished composure utterly gone. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a ragged, choked whisper that barely carried across the stage. Who are you? He asked the question not one of identity, but of existence. How could something so magnificent exist right under his nose, completely unseen? Ilara finally turned her eyes to him. There was no triumph in her gaze, no malice, no I told you so. There was only a calm, unshakable truth. She answered with 3 simple words that redefined her world and shattered his. I am a musician. The power of that simple declaration hung in the air, rendering any further conversation pointless. The story of that rehearsal became an instant legend within the classical music world. The benefactor's gala was, of course, rearranged. Troves. Migraine miraculously cleared, but it was too late. The benefactors, having heard whispers of the miracle that occurred in the hall, demanded to hear the woman from the stories. 1 year later, the Orpheum Philharmonic Hall was fuller than ever. On the marquees in brilliant gold letters, it read, "Tonight, Ilara Vance plays the world premiere of Symphony of Embers." A new wing of the conservatory was being built, funded by a massive, anonymous donation that many suspected came from a profoundly humbled Maestro Thorn, who had quietly retired from conducting. Ilara, now a celebrated artist, did not forget the shadows she came from. She used her newfound fame and fortune to establish a foundation, the Nightingale Trust. Dedicated to providing instruments and lessons to underprivileged children, the final scene is not of her on a grand stage, but in a brightly lit room in the new conservatory wing. She is seated not at a grand piano, but at a simple upright, much like the one from her childhood. Beside her sits a young girl with wide, hopeful eyes, her small fingers tentatively placed on the keys. Ilara smiles, her hand gently guiding the child's. "Don't be afraid," she says softly. "The music is already inside you. You just have to let it out." The camera pans back as the first, simple notes of a melody fill the room. A testament to the enduring truth that true worth is not measured by applause or status, but by the quiet, resilient passion of the human heart, and the grace with which we share our most precious gifts.